Hi, this is John Harcher, and welcome to episode 27 of Keep On Grooving. It's been around 2 years, but we're getting a new release this year. Well, not 100% new, but newly configured. So we'll talk about the April 26, 1969 show at the LA Forum, its two different releases, how it compares to the show the next day in Oakland, and how this entire week in April 1969 began the transition from the Jimi Hendrix experience towards the next phase in Hendrix's career. Episode 27, The Sony Era 2022, live at the LA Forum, April 26, 1969. Well, it's been a while since we've had a new release of sorts, and this one kind of follows on the one new release from last year, the Record Store Day vinyl version of the October 9th, 1967 Paris Olympia show that added two songs back into the running order from the CD version. This year, we get a number of reissues. The Record Store Day offering is a reissue of the vinyl reissue of the Dagger release Burning Desire. Target is also releasing an exclusive vinyl condensed version of the BBC sessions. I have to think the pandemic and other vinyl pressing issues led to these particular decisions, but either way, they need to get new vinyl versions pressed in any case, so who knows what the exact reasons are. The mainstream release on Sony is a standalone reissue of the LA Forum show from 1969. This was the one that was recorded for possible use for a prospective live album, but the live album was scrapped. No songs from the show were used for In the West, or Jimi Hendrix concerts for that matter, and it sat in the vaults for almost 20 years until it aired as the concluding segment of the live and unreleased radio show in 1988. That finally opened the floodgates, and the second song in the set, Foxy Lady, was added to the Reprise CD reissue of the Jimi Hendrix concerts. Then the remaining songs in the set were released as the fourth disc of the Lifelines box set, which in turn was a CD reissue of the overseas album version of the radio show Live and Unreleased. Whew. Nothing else was done with it until the 2000 box set, where the 1969 mix of I Don't Live Today was released. This was followed 10 years later by the Star Spangled Banner Purple Haze medley, which was also mixed for the live album, released on West Coast Seattle Boy. However, nothing from LA made the expanded reissue of In the West, which ended up acting as a distaff reissue of the San Diego show from May 25th, 1969. Of course, missing a few songs. This led to some interest in having the entire LA show reissued, so we're finally getting it. Now, when I went to check on a few things in the Ultimate Hendrix book, I noticed an interesting thing about the week of the concert. It's not only the first week Billy Cox came to New York and played on some sessions, it's also the week Jimi played with some of the guys from the Cherry People and recorded things like Crash Landing, Drone Blues, and an early attempt at Roomful of Mirrors. So we'll deal with the days leading up to the show, then talk about the releases of the LA show and how they compare, and then cap off the week with a look at the Oakland show that came out on Dagger almost 25 years ago already. Wow. To set the stage, the experience spent the first 2 weeks or so of April 1969 in several New York recording studios trying to get things going. A few days at Olmsted Studios yielded the Midnight/Trashman twofer, and some time at the record plant gave us a couple of studio takes of Hear My Train A-Comin', a remake of Stone Free, and a demo for Nightbird Flying called Ships Passing Through the Night. Now, none of these were released in Jimi's lifetime, but made it out on a variety of posthumous releases. With that, the experience was done as a studio entity, but was still active on the road. A mid-April weekend swing found them in Tennessee and the Lone Star State for 3 concerts. The opening act for all 3 was Noel's side band Fat Mattress. The third show also had Cat Mother and the All Night Newsboys on the ticket. The second show had an additional act as well, a band that would join Cat Mother as openers for the LA show. Their sound was distinctly different from the Experience, owing to their prominent horn section. Jimi also praised their lead guitarist Terry Kath as someone he enjoyed listening to. Yes, we're talking about none other than the Chicago Transit Authority, who later shortened their name to Chicago. I think they ended up doing okay for themselves. Right before they left for the shows, Jimi had a meeting about his big upcoming project. No, not an album, but a recording studio of his own. The Old Generations Club on West 8th Street was for sale, and Jimi and Mike Jeffrey discussed running the club themselves and possibly putting a little studio in the back. Eddie Kramer chimed in and said they were nuts. Go all in on the studio and make it the state-of-the-art facility in the city, which is what they decided on. The long story of the creation of Electric Lady Studios will be told, hopefully eventually when they get the box set out. On Monday, April 21st, Billy Cox arrived in New York for the first time. Jimi had told him he'd be met with a big limo and all, but there wasn't anybody there at the airport to meet him. As he later said, I know Jimi wanted me there, but I'm not sure anybody else did. Jimi helped him get set up in the city, then brought him down to the record plant. The two immediately fell back into their old patterns and started coming up with new material right off the bat. The first pattern they came up with was one that evolved into First Pass It On, then Straight Ahead. Then after that, they came up with the pattern for Earth Blues. Jimi had Angel and pieces of Easy Rider in various states of development, and some of the stuff he worked on at Olympic before the Royal Albert Hall shows became Message of Love and Valleys of Neptune. Here he was bouncing ideas off his old friend and came up with some things that would develop into a couple of the tentpole songs of the First Rays era. That night over at the Scene Club, Jimi ran into Al Marks, a musician he met at Monterey, or at least Al remembered him meeting Jimi. Jimi asked him if his band, the Cherry People, had their drummer handy, and their drummer, Rocky Isaacs, was indeed there. Hendrix invited all of them over to the record plant for 4 a.m. jam/recording session. Once there, Jimi had Al, Rocky, and guitarist Chris Grimes join him to work on another long gestating song, Room Full of Mirrors. Jimi had done a demo of it during the Electric Lady Night session with his old harmonica-playing buddy, Paul Caruso. He debuted live at Royal Albert Hall while also working at it at Olympic. The arrangement done at the record plant was still in the rambling style of the Royal Albert Hall version, but a little tighter and a little quicker. However, it took Rocky around 30 or so takes to get the somewhat complex rhythm pattern down, much to Jimi's annoyance. But when you hear it on a Purple box, it sounds really good. Sometimes an artist can be too close to his work. The next night was momentous in that it was the first jam session of Jimi Hendrix, Billy Cox, and Buddy Miles. They weren't the Band of Gypsies yet, but at the same time, there they were. They worked on a large number of unfinished takes of Manish Boy that were later pieced together to make the one on the Blues album, though supposedly the one on Both Sides of the Sky was complete. Go figure. On the 24th, the Cherry People were back, and Jimi went back to a song he'd begun work on with Buddy the previous month. It started out as Hey Gypsy Boy. In this session, it was Hey Country Boy. So other takes also involved the main pattern that became Message of Love. Needless to say, Jimi's abrupt changes were fine for Billy, but tough on the other guys to follow. This pattern continued with the next song, Crash Landing. We've spoken about how this song would evolve into First Freedom, then Dolly Dagger, and how both Alan Douglas and Experienced Hendrix tried to fix the song with kind of lackluster results. Just release one of the takes on their own. They're just fine for what they are. Drone Blues and a version of Ships Passing in the Night ended this session, as well as Jimi's work with the Cherry People. Talk about being at the right place at the right time. Once that was done, Jimi, Mitch, and Noel headed out to the West Coast for a couple of weekend concerts. Live at the LA Forum, April 26, 1969. So let's talk about the concert itself before discussing the various presentations of it, including our newest release here. As mentioned, Cat Mother and Chicago opened up that night. The crowd was a little on the rowdy side, and the police were on hand in case things got out of hand. As Jimi took the stage, he sounded very upbeat and happy. During the intro, he dedicated the show to a bunch of folks, and among them, he mentioned the Smothers Brothers. Now, what made him mention a comedy act here? To bring everyone up to speed, Tom and Dick Smothers were indeed brothers who came up with an act in the early 60s that mixed comedy and a little singing. They were pretty popular and ended up getting their own primetime show on CBS. This was in the era and on the same network as Ed Sullivan. So they decided to focus their show in a different direction. They brought in a bunch of up and coming young writers. One of them went on to do pretty well for himself, Steve Martin. In the cast of characters, there was comedian Pat Paulsen, who kind of ran for president in 1968, and Bob Einstein, who played the cop on the scene, Officer Judy. Like Martin, Einstein went on to greater fame later on a Canadian comedy show, Bizarre, where he played a professional stuntman whose stunts usually went horribly and tragically wrong. Yes, talking about the man himself, Super Dave Osborne. So the Smothers Brothers ran for a few years and brought on their own series of acts. It was on their show that The Who made such a memorable appearance thanks to Keith Moon's love of pyrotechnics. In 1967, the boys brought on Pete Seeger, who had been doing the protest thing for a couple decades, to do an anti-war song. CBS cut it out. But they kept on pushing the envelope and bringing people on until in April 1969, the network just pulled the plug on the show. So Jimi was reacting in solidarity to that news. Tommy and Dick are both still with us, though Dick had some kind of medical issue that made him do one of those commercials with the umpteen disclaimers about how bad this medicine is for you, but take it anyway. Well, Mom did like him best after all. The Experience opened the show with Tax Free, a cover of an unreleased song, well, their version at that point anyway. The song was originally by the Swedish duo of Bo Hansen and Jan Carlson. They were sort of a proto-progressive rock act complete without their organ music. They released their debut album, Monument, which featured the 7-minute epic Tax Free. When Jimi did the Scandinavian tour in early 1968, the duo opened for him a couple times, and they hit it off with the guitarists jamming with them here and there. When he got back to England, Jimi immediately began working on his own version of Tax Free, along with some Dylan song about a watchtower or something like that. He did further work on the song in early May when they got to the record plant in New York. But in the end, the song did not make Electric Ladyland. As we talked about early on in the series, the song was finally released on War Heroes with some additional drum work from Mitch. Having opted against a studio version, the band began to do the song live almost immediately, as early as February 1968. By later that year, it had become a regular part of their repertoire, with the song being a major part of the Winterland run. Once Electric Ladyland came out, the song began to be worked out of the set. They did play it at Royal Albert Hall in the show that wasn't filmed or heavily unofficially released February 18th. The set opening performance at LA was the penultimate Experience performance of the song, with the final version coming in their last performance at Denver. It was meant to be a jam where the boys could each get their own solo sections. Once they added Sunshine of Your Love to the set list, Noel got a spotlight song for himself, so it became much less needed for that, though there are quite a number of shows where both songs were performed, including this one. Mitch does get a solo in this version, most of which regular audiences haven't actually heard. We'll get to that. The shorter versions of the song ran right around the length of the original, 7 or 8 minutes. When Alan Douglas made his edit of one of the Winterland performances of the song, it ended up being around this long. The one in this show ran in the 15-minute range and gave Jimi plenty of room to try things out and get warmed up. The next song in the set was Foxy Lady, a concert staple from the early days. Jimi tended to have two different types of versions of the song. A slow, heavy version that would run 5+ minutes, like the ones at Winterland, as we've seen sometimes as long as 9 minutes at the Banded Gypsies and Isle of Wight. There was also a quicker paced one. This is the one he played at Monterey, and my favorite version, Maui, and the kind that was played here. It's very energetic and would have made a great live album opener, which may have been the point since this concert was being recorded after all. Next came Red House. Somewhere along the way, it changed from a minor blues workout to an epic blues workout. The song was already getting long during the Winterland run. Now it had evolved into a semi-suite of sorts, with the solo section having various movements. The wah-wah section, the quiet jazzy section, and things like that. This type of performance of the song would reach its apex with the version from San Diego a month later that would appear on In the West. Post-experience versions of the song were usually less epic in the 8 to 10 minute range until we get the one at Isle of Wight, which ran almost 12. The LA one was singled out on the Variations on a Theme CD, so it's up there with the best. Next up was Spanish Castle Magic. As I mentioned in the Axis Bold as Love episode, this is the song that was performed the most from the album. It made its debut on the Christmas Eve BBC show and remained on the set list all the way through the very end until the very last show at Femar. Normally, it was a somewhat stretched out version, like the one on the Live at Winterland CD, expanded to twice its usual length. But in this era, it would end up running in the 10 plus minute range. Now in LA, the song didn't end, it sort of melded into the next song, The Star Spangled Banner. Jimi began performing it in late 1968 as an opener to Purple Haze. Back then it was very freeform, but eventually began to take shape as a recognizable song. It also took shape as a sort of protest number, with Jimi saying, "Remember this one we was all brainwashed with?" It was an evolution for Jimi, who had given some interviews in the UK early on that were somewhat supportive of the Vietnam War. But like a lot of other people, that changed over time. As it would famously do at Woodstock, the Star Spangled Banner segued into Purple Haze, and like Foxy Lady, it had its slow and fast incarnations. The ones following Star Spangled Banner tended to be among the faster versions. This one has a unique ad-lib drawing attention to the security that had begun to try to calm the crowd down. "Excuse me while I kiss a policeman," is one of my buddy Darren's favorite lines. The audience was getting more and more rowdy, so they had to admonish them from the stage to calm down. They next did I Don't Live Today as their next to last song, a kind of odd placement in this set. It usually works better towards the beginning or in the middle, but it was an enthusiastic performance, one usually considered among the best they've done. The song started appearing in the set list after Monterey over the summer of 1967, but it really didn't become a set staple until 1968. After the experience broke up, it really wasn't part of their repertoire. It wasn't done at Woodstock or at the Bandit Gypsy show, and was only done at one of the Berkeley shows, as well as two others that week. The Cops came on stage one more time and really let the audience know they were on the verge of shutting the whole thing down. Jimi was able to calm the audience down just enough to finish the concert. The show closed with the now traditional concert ending Voodoo Child Sight Return, but this one had a twist. Towards the end of the song, the band breaks out into a full-on rendition of Sunshine of Your Love, complete with bass solo, before going back to the original song to finish the show out. Jimi started to add songs into the end of Voodoo Child quite a bit. He did pieces of what would become Stepping Stone in the version at Woodstock, and at the second show at Berkeley, he did Midnight Lightning Keep on Grooving. But it wasn't at every show. The one the next day and the later San Diego show were just Voodoo Child. It's like he felt like he had to change things up to keep things interesting. Either way, it's a terrific, inspired version. Now, Mitch does another drum solo that leads into Sunshine of Your Love, so maybe that's why they felt like it was okay to edit the earlier one out. Like I said, we'll talk about that in a minute. As we mentioned, the show was recorded by Wally Heider for possible use on a live album, but nothing from it was ever used on any live album or posthumous collection until the Live and Early show in 1988. To end out the special, a mostly full version of the show premiered Labor Day weekend. For those who weren't around back then, hearing a whole concert on the radio was a big thing, but it was actually a regular occurrence. The King Biscuit Flower Hour was the usual outlet for shows like this. One week it's Zeppelin, the next week The Who, then Steve Miller, Rush, Joe Walsh, ELP, you name it. But due to Jimi's death in 1970, he was kind of outside the usual window of their shows, so a complete-ish show from him was worth seeking out, especially one that hadn't been heard since it was recorded. A year later, as mentioned earlier, the first officially released track from the show, Foxy Lady, appeared as a bonus track on the Reprise CD reissue of Jimi Hendrix Concerts. It's not really a great closing song, but the CD had about 5 minutes of space left, and most versions of Purple Haze tended to run about 6 minutes, either on its own or including the Star Spangled Banner intro, so they went with this. Then in 1990, when Reprise put out their own version of the radio show as Lifelines, they did the overseas Castle version one better and put the concert on along with it. Of course, without Foxy Lady, since it was already available. They also did a little editing to the drum solo in Tax Free. Alan did the same thing with Mitch's solo in Stone Free on Jimi Hendrix Concerts. Not sure why the radio show had it complete, and it's not that long, maybe a minute and a half or two at best. I mean, we're not talking about Toad or Moby Dick here. The mix for that album was brand new by Alan Douglas and Bruce Gary, not using any of the previous one done for the possible 1969 live album. It's okay. There's some nice echo on Tax Free. Overall, it's a little on the bassy side, but I think that was generally in line with the feel of the time. Digital was still in its young stage, and at first, when things were mastered, they were mostly done on the bright side. By the late 80s, early 90s, they began to find other aspects of the recording they could enhance, so this one played up the heavy side. But it was a welcome addition to the catalog, and it was enhanced the next year with the release of the San Diego show on stages. So now let's fast forward 30 years. Experienced Hendrix took over the catalog and cleaned out a lot of the clutter of the Douglas era. But along with the questionable material, a lot of quality was removed as well, and the LA show was one of them. The issue with it was, of course, being tacked onto a radio show that didn't necessarily need to be put back into wider circulation. For quite a while, fans speculated when this show in San Diego would get back into circulation. Then we got the teases on the 2 box sets and the almost full San Diego set on In the West. But when were we going to get Los Angeles? Answer, 2022, seemingly in place of a box set. For the new release on November 18th, 2022, they went back to the drawing board. The show would be newly mixed by Eddie Kramer instead of relying on the 1969 mixes, however many of those were done. It may be only I Don't Live Today and the Star Spangled Banner and Purple Haze twofer were done back then. Wonder if they did Foxy Lady. LA music journalist Randy Lewis did one essay for the liner notes, and the other was by the guitarist for Moving Sidewalks, a band that had opened for Jimi around that time, like 1968 or so, and somebody who was actually at the LA show, the bearded one himself, Billy Gibbons of ZZ Top. Now, Billy says Jimi called him like the best guitarist of all time, which is the same thing Jimi supposedly said about Terry Kath of Chicago. Like many other stories, like the one about Jimi liking Terry Kath more than himself, there's been some fog about certain aspects of it, but there's a solid grain of truth buried in there. Jimi was known to be very self-deprecating and playing down his own talent. So saying good things about Terry and Billy would have been right in line with his attitude and not something to be completely dismissed as totally false. This is the problem where one guy is gone and isn't there to correct or back up the story. Here's a famous example involving impresario extraordinaire Bill Graham that we were just talking about again recently on the Hoffman boards. Should have brought it up when I was doing the Band of Gypsies, but here's as good a place as any. The story goes, after one of the Band of Gypsies shows, Jimi came up to Bill Graham and asked him what he thought of the show. Graham kind of hemmed and hawed and said, it's okay. Jimi could tell he had a problem, so he pushed him on it, and Bill told him he did everything but play the guitar. He twirled it, he humped it, all the show stuff, but not play. So the next show, Jimi went out and didn't move, just played the whole show. He comes off before the encore, goes up to Graham and says, how was that, MFer? Graham laughed and said, go out and do your thing. So he goes out and gives the show for the encore. Now, there is the grain of truth there that both backs up and contradicts the story, and that is provided by the video from the first show on January 1st. It does show Jimi playing still for most of the show, as it impressed on Steve Vai. You know, the guitar screaming bloody murder, and then you watch the video, and he's just standing there. But later on in the set, when Jimi does Foxy Lady, he goes through his usual animated performance. What most likely happened is Bill Graham probably wasn't impressed by the second show on New Year's Eve. As I mentioned back when talking about the concert, it was a very long show but had some soft spots, including a clunky Foxy Lady towards the end. I remember the encores were left off the box set. But the end of the next night, Jimi certainly did pull out all the stops during the encore, including Wild Thing. So the particulars may be off, but the grain of truth is in there somewhere. When the set was announced, both CD and vinyl versions were pictured. For those of us who knew the set from its previous releases and from bootlegs, we knew something was going to have to be cut to fit it on one CD once they put Foxy Lady back in place. If this had been an album first, it would have fit on a 2 LP set no problem, since the concert was around 82, 84 minutes, somewhere in that ballpark. To get it onto a single CD, they would have had to go back to the old days and drop a song, like Foxy Lady, or really cut out a lot of the intersong material and maybe even speed it up a little bit. To use an example from a different medium, the original rental copy of the VHS version of The Dirty Dozen was slightly sped up, so the 150-minute movie ran around 137 minutes and nothing was edited out. I was like, hey, The Dirty Dozen's 2.5 hours. Why is it done at 10:17? Wait, what's going on? Now, Tax Free ended up being released complete, drum solo and all. Of all the songs on the set, it was Spanish Castle Magic that ended up being the one that got cut. But at the same time, there was unreleased material in there as well. Around 4 minutes into the song, Jimi does some scratching in time to the intro beat, like he does that for around 30 seconds, like he does 8, 9, 10 times. It appears that 24 or 25 seconds were cut out of this section compared to the version on Lifelines. However, around 8.5 minutes in, there's a completely new section during the slow part before the song revs back up to its conclusion. So I edit anything at all. It may have been a matter of fitting the show on a one CD. If you add those 25 seconds back into the song, it leaves the concert around 12 seconds over the maximum length that a CD can hold. This way, if anything had to be cut, let it be something where there's not a lot of musical value lost. And I think that was the case with this section. Otherwise, the new mix opens the sound of the three instruments up quite a bit. The Lifelines one is clear, but it's just kind of there. It's a little flat, like you said, it's a little bassy, so there's kind of like a layer in front of it. This one, you can hear the different positions of the instruments and all. They did that sometimes annoying thing of including the intro to a song at the end of the previous track. I know they do it so that the song starts off right at the beginning, like right when you click on it, the song starts up. But I've always preferred to have the intros with the song itself. Plus, they decided to break up the Voodoo Child Sunshine If You Love medley into 3 parts, but didn't name the final part either like continued or conclusion. So that was a little odd there. But overall, it's a very nice package. It sounds great.
Now compare this to how the show the next day was treated. On Sunday, the band traveled up to the Oakland Coliseum and played an 85-minute set there. It's actually very similar to the set they played a month later in San Diego, with one exception. The show opened with a couple of hits, Fire and Hey Joe. They moved into Spanish Castle Magic, not quite as long as LA, but longer than the 5 to 6 minute versions. Next was Hear My Train A-Comin', a song that for some reason Jimi did not play at the recorded shows at LA or San Diego. Was this an oversight, on purpose, or something else? I just don't know. Next was a jam on Sunshine of Your Love and a slightly longer than LA Red House, right around the length of San Diego a month later. The show ended with a run of hits, Foxy Lady done in an epic slow fashion running over 10 minutes long, The Star-Spangled Banner, Purple Haze, and a nearly 20-minute Voodoo Child with Jefferson Airplane bassist Jack Cassidy getting the sole distinction of playing on both Voodoo Childs. This show was not officially recorded, but an audience tape did turn up. Unfortunately, the guy who recorded it was standing right next to the guy who was so surprised to hear Purple Haze, he had to let everyone know it. Experience Hendrix got a hold of it and put it out as the very first Dagger release back in 1998. They spread it out over 2 discs, with disc 1 having the first part of the show up through Red House, and disc 2 containing the closing hits section. 2 songs lasting over half an hour combined helped make that decision. Since it was mail order only and not a general release, they put out the entire audience tape without editing, since people had to make the effort to get it instead of going to the record store and blindly picking it up. Remember, this is back in the pre-internet ordering days. Plus, the sound quality made it less than optimal for a general release, so that's why Experience Hendrix and MCA opted for the quote-unquote bootleg label. But it's worth a listen to compare and see how the band sounded one day to the next. As I've often said, for a band that was falling apart, they're making pretty good music. Overall, it's great to have this piece of the Hendrix puzzle, namely the LA show, back in wide circulation. Now, if only we can get the whole San Diego show out once and for all. Next time, it'll be the 2nd annual Keep on Grooving Holiday Special, this time on video. We'll be going over the same materials last year. There's only so many years Jimi did anything around Christmas, but I'll add in a few more details along the way, like where George's Club 20 was and how I might have actually driven by there some years later. We'll also look at the history of Hendrix box sets and which ones would make great Christmas gifts. That's next time on Keep on Grooving. Hope everyone in the U.S. had a great Thanksgiving, and happy 80th birthday to the subject of our show. All the music we've missed out on. As always, please hit the subscribe button if you like what you're hearing, wherever you're listening to us. I'm John Hartjar. Thanks for listening.